Welcome, welcome, come on in. The show's about to begin. Grab your seat and feel the nostalgia grow. Sit tight, relax, and enjoy the ride. We're so glad you're here. Let's go. It's time for Let's Play with AppleMatt.
Your newspaper would be one of the first businesses to appear in any old West town. In fact, sometimes the newspaper appeared before the town. You see, the local investors would hire themselves a newspaper editor to praise their new town's virtues to potential settlers from back east. Now, since these editors knew where their interests lay, they seldom let the facts get in the way of a good story. For instance, when Wyatt Earp was making headlines in Tombstone, the city had two papers. The Nugget was partial to Sheriff Johnny Behan and regularly made Wyatt out to look bad. But the Epitaph was owned by Mayor John Clum, Wyatt's ally and his lifelong friend, and it always mentioned what a good job Wyatt was doing. So, to get at the truth, you kind of had to read between the lines. The writers and the editors who came through this door might not have had credentials, but they certainly had a flair for the language. The Tombstone Epitaph's first editorial declared that Tombstone is a city set upon a hill, promising to vie with ancient Rome upon her 7 hills, in a fame different in character, but no less in importance. Whew! Wonder if that writer got overcome by the ink fumes. Some say that the town founder, Ed Schifflin, proposed the name for the Tombstone's first newspaper, the Epitaph. The editor didn't like it. Epitaphs are usually mere chiseled lies, is what he said. Well, Ed Schifflin replied, they tell the truth about as often as the newspapers. He had a point there, so the name stuck. The Tombstone Epitaph is still published to this very day. The Earps and the Clantons weren't the only ones in Tombstone cooking up a feud. The editors of the various newspapers had a hard time stomaching each other's pearly prose. In 1882, a couple of editors came close to having an old-fashioned duel over their differences. They called it off, though. I guess the local boys had to find some other entertainment that day. Welcome to the railroad station and telegraph office. Your train might be coming in at any minute. Oh, in case some of you 21st century buckaroos have never seen a train, it was a large device for conveying people, freight, and livestock over long distances in a land with no freeways. We have an actual train sitting here in town. Be sure to check it out. Now, railroads helped to create the Old West of legend, and they helped to destroy it. They created many towns, such as Wyatt Earp's rip-roaring Dodge City, where the trains met the Texas cattle drives. But the railroad also ended the native tribes' freedom to roam, and it began a buffalo hunting stampede that drove the bison near to extinction. Them trains also put an end to the long-distance stagecoach. Finally, once the railroads provided regular transportation to the east, frontier towns began to lose the isolation that had let them be so wild and so colorful. So, look around, but be careful. You might find yourself buying a ticket from the Old West back to the future. Towns like Tombstone were so intrigued with the Eastern visitors that if you didn't make it to the station to see them, you could read about them in the local newspaper. You see, the papers got information from the hotel registers and printed a list of all the dudes, soaplocks, and other Jonathans who were passing through town. This suitcase held the few belongings of an orphan. There were countless orphans in the eastern cities during the last half of the 19th century, victims of the accidents and diseases which claimed the lives of their parents. The more progressive people in the East occasionally made attempts to resettle the orphans. One New York charity claimed to have brought more than 90,000 youngsters to new homes in the West. The contents of a man's luggage told the story of his life. For example, if these belonged to a gambler, you'd probably find fancy clothes, a derringer or two, and a few packs of playing cards. A deck of cards was called a railroad Bible, and the games like poker were standard diversions as people crossed the West by train. Card sharps were everywhere, and more than 300 were said to be on the Union Pacific system alone. Conductors tried to steer passengers away from the crooked gamblers and warned the card sharps to stop their trade or risk being shot. The rails were used by tourists, businessmen, traveling salesmen, and anyone else who could afford to travel. And a counter like this is where they bought their tickets. It cost $173 to get from one end of the country to the other. And Eastern tourists saw things that they'd only read about in dime novels, prospectors and Indians, cactus and buffalo, stuff you didn't often run across in New York City. Cash registers came into use around the 1880s. They were affectionately known as thief catchers because a bell rang whenever a clerk opened the drawer, making it a bit harder for unscrupulous workers to dip into the till. You might think the newspapers of the Old West, like this one, only carried local news, but the Telegraph allowed stories from Washington or New York to appear in the West almost as fast as they were printed in the Eastern papers. In smaller towns, people counted on the newspaper to announce those local events. And in a town near the camp of a company building the railroad, one of the biggest events was a prize fight. Wyatt Earp was a skilled boxer and often fought for money when he worked those railroad camps of Wyoming in 1868. Railroad lines and telegraph lines were often laid out at the same time. In fact, in a number of western towns like ours, the train station and the telegraph office were the same place. You see, them telegraph lines helped distant train stations control their rail traffic safely. This was because electricity moves faster than trains, faster than bandits too. In fact, the coming of the telegraph helped put western outlaws out of business. Your speedy horse might outrun the local marshal, but it couldn't beat that telegraph signal. So neighboring towns would be warned all about you before you even arrived. Wanted posters like these were a common sight at the railroad stations of the West, but they didn't just advertise the faces of local criminals. News about robberies or murders committed in other parts of the territory spread quickly along the telegraph wires, and deputy marshals carried wanted posters in their saddlebags as they traveled through the territory. You can learn more about wanted posters at the sheriff's office. Although Samuel Morse invented the telegraph in 1837, it wasn't used to control trains until 1851, and it greatly improved train travel. For the first time, stations from all points along the route could contact each other and report track conditions or scheduling changes. In smaller towns, the telegrapher doubled as the station agent who sold tickets and handled baggage as well. The station agent used a ledger like this to record injuries received by passengers and train workers along the track in the station's jurisdiction. Everything from bruised arms to crushed bodies is required by federal law. I wonder if the death of Frank Stillwell was recorded in a ledger like this after he was killed by the Earps at the train station in Tucson. This clever device passed sacks of mail to the trains that weren't stopping at the station. The mail was put into a sack and hoisted up to the top of a crane, from which it hung like a body on a gallows. A hook on the side of the train scooped up the sack as the train sped by and was reeled in by a clerk in the mail car. Stop by the post office to find out about another kind of mail service. The person who packed a Saratoga trunk like this might be traveling from the east in search of a new home. Thousands traveled westward, encouraged by the railroads to take up life as farmers on land along the railroad right-of-way, land that had extended for miles on either side of the tracks. The railroads charged the new farmers little for this land, expecting to earn a profit by shipping supplies. All too often, though, the land was ill-suited for farming, and there were stories of railroad companies who billed farmers for the land in later years at excessive prices. Packages like these often contained mail-order merchandise from places like Sears Roebuck and Montgomery Ward, filled with things that people couldn't find at the local stores. A Western lady might send away for a fancy Eastern-style dress, while a farmer might order the tools that he couldn't get from the local blacksmith. Catalog companies even sold prefabricated houses that would arrive on the back of a railroad flat car. The contents of a man's luggage told the story of his life. For example, if these belonged to a gambler, you'd probably find fancy clothes. Wheelchairs have been around since the 1700s, and this one serves as a reminder that some people came west for their health. In fact, Doc Holliday might never have ended up in Tombstone if he wasn't stricken with consumption, what they call tuberculosis nowadays. The dry climate might have done him some good, but the time he spent drinking in the smoky saloons surely wasn't what the doctor ordered. A silver dollar is yours, partner, if you can answer this question. The next time you come around here, you had better be a little sharper. Trains in Wyatt Earp's day rarely went more than 30 or 40 miles an hour, even when they weren't delayed by robberies or animals on the track. Still, that could get you from Omaha, Nebraska to Sacramento, California in as little as 4 days. That seemed pretty darn fast to us, when you consider that going by stagecoach took weeks. Now, of course, the precise speed of travel was proportional to how you traveled. There was a kind of a class system on board. First, second, and third class, to be exact. Now, you poke around the train to find out more about that, and to find out what made this little train go. The fireman was the man responsible for shoveling them 4 tons of coal or wood into a firebox, which sat below the locomotive's boiler. Steam from the boiler filled the pistons that turned the engine's iron wheels. Meanwhile, the smoke from the firebox left the train by way of this here smokestack. These here bells and whistles, if you will, help the train crew and the station crew communicate with each other. 4 long blasts of this whistle was the signal for train broken two. In other words, the cars had gotten decoupled. A very serious situation that could send a dozen cars tumbling from the track. A short blast was a signal to the brakeman, who ran across the top of the cars and turned large wheels to set the brakes. Each brakeman was responsible for 2 to 5 cars, and setting the brakes was considered an art, because a brake set too tight could flatten a train's wheels or cause the train to break in two. Looking at these iron wheels, a man thinks of the iron rails on which the wheels ran, and of the people who sweated and died to link the eastern and western halves of the United States. Cross-country railroad building began in 1862, when the U.S. Congress granted huge chunks of western land to the railroad companies. The Union Pacific Railroad built west from Omaha, Nebraska, using a crew of mostly Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans. The Central Pacific Railroad built east from California, relying primarily on some 12,000 Chinese laborers who worked remarkably hard but got only two-thirds the wages of white workers and often lived in far worse conditions than other workers. After overlapping the routes nearly 200 miles, the Union and Central Pacific Railroads finally joined tracks at Promontory Summit, Utah in 1869, and a golden spike was driven into the track to mark the occasion. Of course, it was removed as soon as the ceremony was over. Starting the very next day, there was daily service between Omaha and Sacramento. In addition to setting the brakes of the train, the brakeman had to couple and decouple the cars. Decoupling was done with a lever like this, but coupling the cars together was an exceedingly dangerous job. In the 1880s, when Wyatt Earp was living in Tombstone, a total of 2,000 railroad workers were killed in action every year, and another 20,000 wounded. This here's the engineer's chair. The chief engineer was the ruler of the roost, like the captain of a ship, aware of every detail and responsible for everyone's safety. It took many years to produce a skilled engineer. Like conductors, they were the aristocracy of the railroad workers. This here's the engineer's chair. The chief The gauges and levers on this engine let the engine fine-tune the pressure inside the boiler, so the train ran at the right speed and safely. Low boiler pressure produced too little steam to turn the wheels, but if the pressure rose too high, the boiler could explode. The gauges and levers on The gauges and levers. The train fireman was responsible for filling up the locomotive's boiler with water from tall towers like this that were set alongside the tracks, as well as keeping all the moving parts of the train oiled and making sure the bells and whistles worked. Trains in Wyatt Earp's day rarely went more than 30 or 40 miles. These cargo doors were large enough to admit beef cattle, horses, and other large freight. You see, hauling freight was more lucrative for the railroads than moving passengers, and special freight cars were built for everything from animals to coal. The coffin of Morgan Earp was carried on a freight car like this on his final train ride when his body was carried to California for burial. And a special mail car was the setting for one of Wyatt Earp's final acts as a lawman. In 1894, when Wyatt was living in San Diego, California, he was asked by the Southern Pacific Railway to ride shotgun on a payroll train traveling from Oakland, California to El Paso, Texas. The train was carrying several $100,000 and arrived in El Paso without incident. In a passenger train of Wyatt Earp's day, your speed of travel was proportional to how you traveled. There was a kind of a class system on board. First, second, and third class to be exact. Click on the seats around me to find out more about that. If you could afford first-class fare, you rode in a special Pullman parlor car. It had much more luxurious seats than these, even had nice fold-down sleeper beds. You get to your destination in 4 days, and well-rested no less. Traveling in second class cost you $80. Moved you at the same speed as the first-class car, but the trip seemed longer because you had to sleep sitting up in your seat. A third-class ticket across the country cost you only $40, but traveling that way could take you 9 or 10 days. Your third-class passengers, mostly one-way immigrants to the West, were treated almost as well as freight and livestock. They sat on plain wooden benches, not on upholstered seats like these, and their cars were often sidetracked to let express trains through. In fact, the writer Robert Louis Stevenson took a third-class trip across the country during Wyatt's time. After surviving it just barely, he wrote, "Few people have praised God more happily than I did." Covering the West with rail lines wasn't cheap. The state and federal governments lent the railroad companies more than $6 million and gave them 180 million acres of land. The railroad companies wanted towns to develop once the tracks were built and lured many a settler to the West with the promise of free or cheap land along the railroad right-of-way. It could have been this very train that President Ulysses S. Grant rode in 1879, looking out this window to behold the fierce beauty of the West. And Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday looked from a window like this while they guarded Virgil and Allie Earp at the Tucson train station. The train was taking the body of Morgan Earp to the Earp family home in Colton, California, for burial. Frank Stillwell was the man suspected of gunning Morgan down, and it was rumored Stillwell was waiting in Tucson with Ike Clanton to ambush the train. Clanton decided not to go, but the Earp party caught Stillwell between trains and gunned him down. Many think Wyatt was the killer. A number of trains provided a ladies' car, where women could ride together and avoid the annoyance of mixed company. There, the gals could look out these windows, watch the passing scenery, talk about, well, whatever it is they talked about. I was never allowed inside one of them cars. On George Pullman's luxurious Pacific Hotel Express trains, while you looked out the window of the dining car, you could feast on roast quail, pheasant, antelope steak, and fresh trout in the Rockies. When robbers struck a train, they'd detach all the cars and then pick through them at their leisure. You can imagine how scared you'd be looking out this window and waiting for them to barge in with guns drawn. Some women would slip their rings and other jewelry into their stockings, hoping the crooks wouldn't be bold enough to look there. Even a second or third class train ride was a lot more comfortable than a stagecoach, because the trains went faster and smoother. And unlike a stagecoach, you could close these windows to keep out the dust or the rain. To make things even more cozy, there was a stove in each car for heating in the winter and a bucket of ice water to drink in the summer. Partner, if you answer my question true, I have a silver dollar for you.